Wild West love stories. Tales of passion, written on the American frontier.
The wind in the Colorado Territory cut like a shard of glass, howling through the crooked bones of a trading post where men sold cattle, saddles, and sometimes their souls. Amidst the grunts of livestock and the jeers of rough men, Ethan Cole stood as a specter of the past, his long coat worn by weather and grief, his eyes shadowed by a hat that hid a world of pain. He had come for a horse, nothing more. He had long ago sworn off the complications of the heart, ever since fire had stolen his world 5 years prior. But then, a sound too soft for this brutal place broke through his solitude. "Can you buy us, mister?" He looked down to see a little girl, Lily, no older than 4, her face smudged with dirt, but her eyes holding an ancient plea. In her arms, she clutched a bundled infant. Her small, trembling hand pointed towards a wooden auction block where a woman stood in shackles, her head bowed, her spirit seemingly broken. The auctioneer's voice boomed. "Next lot. A woman fit for cooking or cleaning. Comes with 2 dependents. Quiet stock, starting at $10. A cruel laugh erupted from the crowd. Ethan's jaw clenched. Every instinct screamed at him to turn away, to retreat back into the numb safety of his loneliness. Yet, in the woman's defeated posture, he saw an echo of a ghost he could never outrun. As another man mockingly bid $5, Ethan stepped from the shadows, his voice cutting through the cold air, calm and clear. 35. Why would a man who had buried his own heart risk everything for 3 strangers? What did he see in them that ripped open a 5-year-old wound? Stay with us to witness a journey of redemption born from a desperate plea. Like, share, and subscribe to Wild West Love Stories, for this is only the beginning of a love that defied death itself. Part 1. Echoes in the Dust. Sevens. The transaction was as stark and silent as the winter landscape that swallowed them whole. With the cold weight of coins no longer in his pocket, Ethan Cole turned from the chaos of the trading post, the jeers and shouts fading behind him into a dull murmur. He gave a curt nod, a silent command for the woman to follow, and began the long walk back to his world. She obeyed without a word, a phantom in worn clothes, her wrists still raw from the shackles. The little girl, Lily, held the bundled infant Samuel with a grim determination that belied her years, her small legs working hard to keep pace with Ethan's long, deliberate strides. He had bought a horse as well, a sturdy gray mare, but he walked, leading it by the reins, his rifle resting in the crook of his other arm. He did not offer the woman or the child a ride. It was not a conscious act of cruelty, but rather a reflection of the chasm that existed between them. He, their reluctant savior, and they, the living embodiment of a complication he had not sought. The trail to his ranch was a path etched into a lonely land of skeletal pines and vast, snow-dusted plains. The sky was a sheet of pewter, heavy and close. No one spoke. The only sounds were the rhythmic crunch of their boots on the frozen earth, the soft snort of the mare, and the vast, mournful sigh of the wind weaving through the canyons. Hours bled into one another, marked only by the shifting light as the sun made its weak journey across the sky. Ethan never looked back, but he was acutely aware of the 2 figures trailing him. He could feel the woman's presence like a cold spot on his spine, an echo of a life he had locked away. He had built his solitude like a fortress, wall by wall, over 5 long years. Each wall was a memory of Eleanor, of her laughter, of the fire that had turned it all to ash. Now, he had, in a moment of what felt like madness, punched a hole in his own defenses and invited the ghosts inside. As twilight began to bleed purple and orange across the horizon, the sharp angles of a cabin and a barn materialized against the darkening hills. This was his home, a place of function over comfort, of survival over living. As they approached, the cabin door creaked open and a figure emerged, silhouetted against the warm lantern light within. Jedediah Jed Stone stood on the porch, a man carved from the same rugged timber as the land itself. His face was a roadmap of harsh seasons and unspoken sorrows, and his eyes, sharp and discerning, took in the scene with a silent, heavy judgment. He looked at the woman, her face still hidden by a curtain of tangled hair. He looked at the small girl clutching the baby. Then, his gaze settled on Ethan, and 1,000 questions were asked in that one, unwavering stare. "What in God's name have you brought home, boy?" Jed's voice was like gravel rolling downhill. Ethan didn't flinch. He stopped before the porch, his face unreadable in the dying light. "They're stayin', Jed." It wasn't an explanation, it was a decree. Jed spat a stream of tobacco juice onto the frozen ground, his eyes narrowing. "For how long is stayin'?" Ethan's gaze flickered for a moment towards the woman. "For as long as it takes." He offered nothing more, and Jed, for all his bluster, knew his place. He had been with Ethan since before the fire, had watched the light in the younger man's eyes die out. He might not understand this madness, but he would abide it. With a disgruntled grunt, he stepped aside, holding the door open. "Well, don't just stand there freezing the devil's spit. Get 'em inside before they catch their death." Sevens. Inside, the cabin was sparse and masculine. A stone hearth dominated one wall, a low fire crackling within. A simple table and 2 chairs sat in the center of the room. On the mantelpiece, above the fire, was a single, silver-framed portrait, a daguerreotype of a young woman with a radiant smile and eyes full of life. It was a shrine and a wound, a daily reminder of all that had been lost. Ethan gestured towards a door leading to a small back room. "You and the children can take that room." The woman, who still had not uttered a sound, finally lifted her head just enough to glance at him. Her eyes were hollowed out by fear and exhaustion. She gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, and herded Lily and the infant into the room, shutting the door quietly behind them. The click of the latch was deafening in the silence. Jed watched the whole exchange, shaking his head slowly as he stoked the fire. "You're courtin' a storm, Ethan. You see the ghost of her in that woman, don't you?" Ethan's jaw tightened. "I see a woman who needed help." Jed sighed, the sound heavy with the wisdom of age. "There's a difference between helpin' a stray dog and bringin' the whole damn wolf pack to your door. You don't know a thing about them." But Ethan did know something, or at least, his gut told him he did. The resemblance was too perfect, too cruel to be a coincidence. It was as if fate were playing a twisted joke, presenting him with a broken mirror of his own shattered past. He felt a rage build within him, a rage at God, at the fire, at this woman for daring to wear Eleanor's face. Later, he ladled some venison stew into 2 bowls and left them on a stool outside the closed door. He knocked once, then walked away, giving her the space he himself so desperately craved. He ate his own meal in silence, the empty chair across from him feeling more vacant than it had in years. The quiet of his home was gone, replaced by a new, charged silence that hummed with unspoken questions and unknown dangers. He spent the rest of the evening cleaning his rifle, the methodical ritual of oiling the steel and checking the mechanism a small comfort in the chaos that had descended upon his life. His eyes kept drifting to the portrait, then to the door. Was she a runaway? A thief? A whore? The possibilities were as ugly as the world he knew. But when he pictured the little girl's face, her unwavering plea, he knew he couldn't have done anything different. Sometime deep in the night, long after Jed had retired to his bunk in the barn, Ethan was startled by a sound from the main room. He rose from his cot, his hand instinctively going to the Colt peacemaker he kept on the nightstand. He moved silently to his doorway, peering into the main cabin, which was bathed in the ethereal glow of the dying embers in the hearth. The woman was standing in the center of the room, a frail silhouette against the faint light. She was not looking at her children's door or towards the main entrance. Her gaze was fixed, utterly transfixed, on the portrait above the mantelpiece. She was staring at the face of Eleanor Vance, at the smiling girl she so unnervingly resembled. As Ethan watched, hidden in the shadows, her shoulders began to shake with silent, racking sobs. A single tear escaped, tracing a clean path through the grime on her cheek, shimmering for a moment in the firelight before falling into the darkness. It was a tear of recognition, a tear of grief. In that moment, Ethan knew. He was not looking at a stranger. He was looking at an impossibility. The ghost in his house had a name, and it was the very one he had carved onto a tombstone 5 years ago. Part 2. A Ghost at the Hearth. Sevens. The morning broke cold and sharp, sunlight glinting off the frost that painted the world in shades of silver and white. But for Ethan Cole, the world had changed its color in the dark. The sight of the woman weeping for a face in a photograph, her own face from another lifetime, had incinerated every last shred of doubt. She was Eleanor. The knowledge did not bring relief, only a deeper, more profound ache. It was one thing to grieve a memory, it was another to live with its ghost. He moved through his morning chores with a heavy, deliberate slowness, his mind a maelstrom of unanswerable questions. If she was alive, where had she been for 5 years? Who were the children? And why, in God's name, hadn't she spoken a single word to him? He saw her from the barn, a fleeting figure moving behind the cabin window. She was no longer just a stranger he'd pitied, but a living, breathing accusation. He felt the familiar weight of guilt settle upon him, the old wound of his failure to protect her tearing open anew. He'd searched for her in the ashes of that boarding house, had accepted the fabricated story of a body burned beyond recognition. He had mourned, and then he had built a fortress of solitude. Now, the fortress was a ruin, and the ghost was inside, sweeping the hearth. Jed watched him from the corral, his expression grim. "You're looking at that cabin like it's about to swallow you whole," the old man observed, his voice a low rumble. Ethan didn't reply, just continued to chop wood with a ferocity that was more about exorcising his own demons than splitting timber. The days that followed unfolded in a tense, unspoken rhythm. Eleanor, he could not bring himself to call her that, not yet, carved out a small existence within the walls of his home. She remained silent, her eyes perpetually downcast, but her hands were never still. She mended one of Ethan's torn shirts with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. She took the meager rations he provided and somehow made them into warm, nourishing meals for her children. She scrubbed the floors until the worn planks gleamed faintly in the firelight. She did all this with a quiet, desperate efficiency, as if trying to earn her keep, to pay for the rescue he had given her. She never ate with him, always waiting until he had finished and retired to his room or the barn before taking her own small portion with the children in the privacy of theirs. And she was always watching her children, especially Lily. Her gaze would follow the little girl's every move, a silent promise of fierce, unbreakable protection. For Ethan, her presence was a constant, throbbing torment. Every gesture, every tilt of her head, was a ghost of a memory. He would catch her profile in the firelight, and for a heart-stopping second, she was the Eleanor he had known, the girl who had promised him forever on a hilltop under a summer sky. Then she would turn, and the haunted, hollowed-out eyes of the stranger would return, and the chasm would open up between them once more. He tried, once, to breach it. He found her by the well, hauling up a heavy bucket of water. "Let me," he said, his voice rusty from disuse. She flinched as if struck, dropping the rope and scurrying back a few paces, her eyes wide with a terror that was absolute. She shook her head, a violent, sharp gesture, before grabbing the rope again and finishing the task herself. After that, he kept his distance. The fragile, unnerving peace was shattered on the fourth day. A raw wind had picked up from the north, carrying the promise of a blizzard. Lily, who had been drawing patterns in the frost on the window pane, suddenly went quiet. When Eleanor went to check on her, the child's head was lolling, her skin radiating an unnatural heat. A whimper escaped Lily's lips. Eleanor's carefully constructed composure disintegrated in an instant. A choked, guttural cry of pure terror tore from her throat as she swept the child into her arms. "No, no, not again," she whispered, the first words Ethan had heard her speak, a frantic, desperate prayer. Ethan, drawn by the cry, burst in from the porch where he'd been securing the shutters. He saw the scene, and his blood ran cold. The child was burning with fever, her small body limp in her mother's arms. The woman, Eleanor, was shaking, her face a mask of primal fear. In that moment, the ghost was gone, replaced by a mother terrified of losing her child. The crisis was a physical thing, a storm that had broken not just outside the cabin, but within it. All the unspoken questions, all the tension and distance, were swept away by the immediate, urgent need to save the child. "Lay her down," Ethan commanded, his voice firm, breaking through her panic. "By the fire." She obeyed without hesitation, her trust in him born of sheer desperation. He bolted the door against the rising wind and began barking orders. "Jed, get the snow mint and yarrow from the stores. Boil water." The hours that followed were a blur of desperate, focused activity. The blizzard raged outside, encasing the small cabin in a world of white, howling fury. Inside, a different kind of storm was being fought. Ethan and Eleanor became an unwilling, unspoken team. He worked tirelessly, bringing bucket after bucket of snow to melt for cool compresses, keeping the fire fed, holding the child steady when convulsions shook her small frame. Eleanor, her panic now channeled into a fierce competence, bathed Lily's forehead, forced sips of herbal tea between her cracked lips, and murmured a constant stream of soft, soothing words, a litany of love and hope against the encroaching darkness. Jed, his earlier skepticism forgotten, proved a steady presence, his old hands surprisingly gentle as he helped grind the herbs. They worked side by side, three strangers bound by the flickering life of one small child. Through the long, terrifying night, Ethan watched her. He saw the strength beneath the fear, the resilience forged in unimaginable hardship. He saw the way she held her daughter, as if she could will her own life force into the child's body. He saw a love so powerful it was a physical presence in the room. And in the crucible of that shared terror, he felt a flicker of the connection he thought had been buried in ash and earth forever. Towards dawn, the fever reached its terrifying peak. Lily was delirious, muttering incomprehensible words, her small body slick with sweat. Eleanor was slumped in a chair, her face pale and drawn, utterly spent from the vigil. "You need to rest," Ethan said, his voice softer than he intended. "I'll watch her." She looked at him, her eyes filled with an exhaustion so deep it seemed ancient, but she nodded, trusting him. He knelt beside the makeshift bed on the floor. He took a fresh, cool cloth from the basin and began to gently wipe the child's face, her neck, her small arms. Her skin was like fire. He tried to soothe her, his large, calloused hand surprisingly gentle as he brushed her damp hair away from her face. As he tucked a stray strand behind her ear, his fingers brushed against her skin, and he froze. His entire world narrowed to a single point. There, just beneath her earlobe, was a small, distinct constellation of 3 dark freckles. His breath hitched in his throat. He slowly, deliberately, raised a trembling hand to his own ear, his fingers finding the identical pattern in the exact same place, a birthmark his mother had once called his lucky stars, a unique signature of his bloodline. The air was punched from his lungs. The cabin, the fire, the howling wind, it all faded away to a deafening roar in his ears. He stared at the child, truly seeing her for the first time. The shape of her brow, the stubborn set of her chin. It was all his. This was not just Eleanor's child. This was his child. This was his daughter. The realization was not a thought, but a physical blow, a seismic shift that cracked the very foundations of his soul. He looked over at the sleeping woman, her face a tragic canvas of suffering and strength, and a new, terrifying question eclipsed all others. How many other secrets was she hiding? The ghost he had brought home hadn't just returned from the grave. She had brought with her a part of his own flesh and blood he never knew he had lost. Part 3. The Devil's Mark. Sevens. As dawn broke, it brought with it a fragile peace. The blizzard had exhausted its fury, leaving the world outside scoured clean and silent, draped in a thick blanket of pristine snow. Inside the cabin, the fever had broken. Lily slept soundly for the first time in 2 days, her breathing deep and even, a faint blush of health returning to her cheeks. The oppressive tension of the vigil had lifted, replaced by the profound, bone-deep weariness of survival. Eleanor sat in a chair by the hearth, her body slumped but her eyes wide awake, fixed on her daughter's sleeping form. She was a guardian statue, unmoving, unwilling to believe the crisis had truly passed. Ethan watched them from across the room, the knowledge of the birthmark a burning coal in his chest. The shared fight for Lily's life had forged a temporary bridge across the chasm between them, but now, in the quiet aftermath, the chasm remained, wider and more treacherous than ever. It was filled now not with suspicion, but with an impossible certainty. He could no longer live with the silence. The ghost in his house had a story, and the time had come to demand it. He waited until he heard Jed's heavy boots crunching in the snow outside as the old man headed for the barn. The cabin was theirs alone. He moved from the shadows, his footsteps unnaturally loud in the stillness. Eleanor tensed, her hand instinctively going to the small knife she kept tucked in her waistband, a pathetic but potent symbol of her will to defend her young. He stopped a few feet away, holding his hands up in a gesture of peace. He did not look at her. Instead, he knelt beside the sleeping form of his daughter. His movements were filled with a strange, new reverence. With a hand that trembled slightly, he gently brushed the hair from Lily's temple, revealing the small constellation of dark freckles just beneath her ear. He held his position for a long moment, his gaze locked on the mark. Then, he slowly lifted his eyes to meet Eleanor's. The raw, unguarded anguish in his face was more potent than any accusation. "My father gave me this mark," he said, his voice a low, ragged whisper as he touched his own ear. "The same way I gave it to her." He looked back at the child, his throat tightening. "I've been calling her Lily in my head. But that's not her name, is it? Tell me her name. Tell me her real name." It was not a demand, but a plea. A plea from a man staring at the wreckage of two lives, his and hers, and begging for a single piece of truth to build upon. Eleanor stared at him, her face a battleground of warring emotions. The fear was still there, a deep-set, animal terror. But beneath it was a flicker of something else, a profound, soul-shattering sorrow. The dam of her 5-year silence, already cracked by the terror of the fever, finally broke. A single sob escaped her, a sound of such complete and utter brokenness that it seemed to tear her apart from the inside. And then came the words, a torrent, a flood of memories she had held back for so long they threatened to drown her. "Clara," she whispered, the name dissolving into another sob. "Her name is Clara Eleanor Cole." She said his name, his last name. The world seemed to stop turning. "The fire! It was never an accident. Ethan!" Her voice was hoarse, a ghost of the melodic tone he remembered, but it was hers. She began to speak, and the story poured out, a litany of horrors that made the blizzard outside seem like a summer breeze. She spoke of a man named Marcus Thorne, a judge, a man of wealth and standing, a man they had met once at a town gathering, who had looked at her with an unnerving intensity she had tried to forget. He was obsessed with his name, his legacy, but his own wife was barren. He had decided, with the cold calculation of a devil, that he would have an heir. He would have her child. The fire at the boarding house was his design, a spectacle to cover his true crime. While the townspeople saw flames, his men were pulling her from a back window, a chloroform-soaked rag pressed over her face. She awoke in the back of a wagon, bound and gagged, being carried west into a life that was not her own. "He told me you were dead," she choked out, the words laced with the agony of that deception. "He showed me a newspaper clipping, a story about a fire, about a heartbroken fiancée who had perished trying to save his love. He said the world believed we both died together, that no one was looking for me." She described the gilded cage she was kept in, a remote house in Kansas. Thorne visited periodically, a specter of polite, chilling control. He forced her into a marriage with one of his lieutenants, a brutish man named Montrose, to create a veneer of legitimacy. "He needed a father for the birth certificate," she said, her voice dropping to a near inaudible whisper. "He needed everything to be clean, legal." The child, their Clara, was born into this lie. Eleanor lived every day in a state of quiet terror, her only purpose to keep her daughter safe. Thorne's threats were constant and insidious. If she ever tried to escape, to tell anyone the truth, he would not kill her. He would simply take Clara away, and she would never see her again. She paused, taking a shuddering breath as she looked at the sleeping infant, Samuel. Montrose. He was a drunk and a monster. Samuel is his son. But Thorne saw him as another piece of property. Another link in the chain holding me there. Her hand went instinctively to the hollow of her throat, her fingers tracing the outline of something that was no longer there. He took everything from me that night. Ethan. Everything. Even your promise. Her eyes filled with fresh tears. The silver locket, the one you had made, with our initials, E and E. One of his men ripped it from my neck as he dragged me out. I saw it fall into the dirt. I think his name was Cain, a cold man, with eyes like a snake. She recounted how Montrose had died a few months ago, falling from a balcony in a drunken stupor. For a brief, flickering moment, she had tasted the possibility of freedom. But she had underestimated Thorne's cruelty. With Montrose dead and her spirit seemingly broken, the judge no longer saw her as a potential mother for his heir, but as a failed investment. He decided to sell her and the children at a discreet auction, a way to recoup his losses and dispose of a dangerous secret. "He was going to sell us south," she whispered, the horror of that fate still fresh in her voice. "To a place I would never be found. I was just a loose end." She finally fell silent, the terrible story hanging in the air between them, as heavy and suffocating as smoke. She had emptied herself of the poison she had carried for 5 years, and now she sat, trembling and exposed, waiting for his judgment. Ethan had not moved. He had listened to every word, every horrific detail, and with each sentence, the man he had been for the past 5 years, the grieving, hollowed-out recluse, was systematically destroyed. The grief did not vanish, but it was transmuted, forged in the crucible of her story into something else entirely. It became a cold, hard, diamond-sharp rage. The ghost of Eleanor Vance was finally at peace, laid to rest not by time, but by truth. In her place was a survivor, a warrior who had endured hell to protect their child. His child. He rose slowly to his feet, the movement that of a man remaking himself. He crossed the room and gently took her hand. It was cold and trembling, but she did not pull away. He looked not at the broken woman before him, but at the fierce mother, the woman who had held on to life for the sake of their daughter. The world was no longer a place of random, cruel fate. It now had a face and a name: Marcus Thorne. The past was no longer a source of pain to be buried, but a crime to be answered for. He was no longer a victim of a tragedy. He was a man with a war to fight. "He may have the law in his pocket," Ethan said, his voice a low, dangerous promise that vibrated with a newfound purpose. "And he may have taken our past. But he does not have her." He squeezed her hand, his gaze locking with hers, a silent vow passing between them. "And he will never have her." Sevens, Part 4. Whispers and Warnings. Sevens. The confession had irrevocably altered the atmosphere within the cabin. The oppressive silence, thick with ghosts and unspoken questions, had been replaced by a new, focused stillness, the quiet of a war council. In the days that followed, Ethan and Eleanor were no longer a reluctant protector and his mysterious ward, but allies bound by a terrible truth and a shared, sacred purpose. They spoke in low, urgent tones late into the night, the fire crackling in the hearth as they pieced together the shattered fragments of their lives. For the first time, Ethan learned the true depths of her resilience, listening to stories of her quiet defiance in captivity, of the ways she shielded Clara's heart from the ugliness of their world. In turn, she began to see the man he had become. The carefree, optimistic youth she had loved was gone, replaced by a harder, sadder man, but one whose core of fierce loyalty and honor had remained untarnished. He listened to her not with pity, but with a simmering, righteous fury that mirrored her own. A fragile trust began to grow in the space between them, nurtured by the mutual goal of protecting the children who were now, undeniably, theirs. Jedediah, observing the transformation, kept his counsel, but his gruff demeanor softened. He saw the light of purpose returning to Ethan's eyes and watched with grudging admiration as Eleanor, no longer a phantom, moved about the cabin with a newfound, albeit wary, confidence. They were beginning to feel like a family, forged not in love and peace, but in the crucible of a shared threat. But the world they were building was a fragile sanctuary, and they both knew the serpent was not far from their door. It was a week after the blizzard when the rider appeared. He did not approach with the haste of an outlaw or the weary slump of a lost traveler. He rode a fine black stallion, and his posture was ramrod straight, his pace measured and deliberate. He was a man who owned the ground he covered. Ethan saw him from a distance, and his hand immediately went to the colt at his hip. He exchanged a look with Eleanor, who was inside with the children. Her face went pale, and she quickly herded Clara and Samuel into the back room. "Stay there. Do not make a sound," she commanded, her voice a tense whisper. Ethan stepped onto the porch, his body language a solid wall of defiance, as the rider drew to a halt. The man was impeccably dressed in a dark duster, his boots polished, his face clean-shaven save for a neat mustache. It was his eyes that betrayed him. They were cold, flat, and missed nothing, the eyes of a predator. He dismounted with an easy grace, his spurs making no sound in the soft earth. "A fine piece of land you have here," the man said, his voice smooth and cultured, a jarring sound in this rugged wilderness. A man could build a proper life here. A legacy. Ethan remained silent, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. The man smiled, a thin, humorless expression. "My name is Silas Kane. I'm an associate of Judge Marcus Thorne. Perhaps you've heard of him?" The name hung in the air like a death sentence. Ethan's face remained a stony mask. "What business does a judge have this far out?" Kane's smile widened slightly. "The judge is a man of many interests, one of which is the recovery of misplaced property. He received word that a woman, an indentured servant by the name of Sarah Montrose, and her 2 dependents absconded from their legal obligations. They were last seen in this territory." Ethan's voice was dangerously low. "There's no one by that name here." Kane let out a soft chuckle, a sound devoid of any warmth. "Is that so? The description is quite specific. A woman of her approximate age, with 2 small children. It would be a serious offense to harbor a fugitive, Mr. Cole. The judge is a stickler for the law." The veiled threat was clear. Every word was a carefully aimed dart, designed to test his resolve. Eleanor watched from the crack in the door, her heart hammering against her ribs. She recognized him now. This was the man with the snake's eyes from that terrible night. This was the man who had ripped her past from her neck. The tension on the porch stretched to a breaking point. Ethan took a slow step forward, his eyes locking with Kane's. "This is my land. The people on it are my family. If you or your judge have a problem with that, you can file your paperwork with the marshal. Now, I suggest you get back on your horse and ride out before you find yourself trespassing." For a moment, Kane's mask of civility slipped. A flicker of cold fury flashed in his eyes. He had expected a broken-down recluse, not this pillar of cold defiance. He knew he could not win with force, not today. So he resorted to a crueler weapon. "A shame," he said, turning as if to leave. The judge is a reasonable man. He understands attachments, but he does not tolerate thieves. With a deliberate, theatrical motion, Kane reached into his waistcoat, as if to pull out a cigar. But instead, his fingers emerged with a pocket watch on a silver chain. And hanging from that same chain, glinting in the pale afternoon sun, was a small, tarnished silver locket, engraved with the unmistakable, entwined initials, E&E, sevens. He let it dangle for a single, pregnant moment, his cold gaze fixed not on Ethan, but on the cabin door behind him. It was a message, a brand, a claim of ownership sent directly to the terrified woman hidden within. He was showing her the shackle she could never remove. Ethan saw it, and a murderous, white-hot rage surged through him, so powerful it almost buckled his knees. He fought the primal urge to draw his gun and erase the smug smile from Kane's face. He knew that was what the man wanted, an act of violence that would give the judge the legal justification he needed. With an effort of will that felt like it was tearing him apart, Ethan held his ground, his voice dropping to a near whisper, colder and sharper than any blade. "You tell your judge," he said, "that some things, once lost, are meant to be found. And you tell him that the next man he sends to my door won't be riding away." Kane's smile was one of pure, reptilian satisfaction. He had delivered his poison. He tipped his hat, a final gesture of mocking civility, mounted his stallion, and rode away, leaving behind a silence more terrifying than any shout. The moment he was gone, Eleanor stumbled out onto the porch, her face ashen, one hand clutching her throat where the locket used to be. The psychological attack had hit its mark. They were not safe. Thorn was not just a memory, he was a hunter, and he was closing in. That night, they made their decision. They could not win this fight alone, barricaded on the ranch. They needed the law, a law bigger than the one Thorn held in his pocket. The next morning, they loaded the children into a wagon and made the long journey to the county seat, Ridgewood. It was a bustling town, full of the noise and promise of civilization, a world away from the isolated quiet of the ranch. They went directly to the U.S. Marshal's office. Marshal Wade Donovan was a man who looked like he'd been hewn from granite. He was methodical, impassive, and listened to their story without interruption. Eleanor, finding a strength she didn't know she possessed, told him everything, her voice trembling but clear. Ethan stood beside her, his presence a silent confirmation of her words. When she finished, Donovan leaned back in his chair, stroking his thick mustache. "That's one hell of a story, ma'am," he said, his tone neither believing nor disbelieving. "You're asking me to investigate a sitting federal judge based on your testimony, a man whose signature is on the warrant that gives me my authority." Ethan stepped forward. "You saw her. You hear her. Are you saying she's lying?" Donovan's eyes were firm. "I'm saying I need proof. A piece of paper, another witness, something more than a ghost story," No offense intended. Without it, my hands are tied. Thorn would have me stripped of my badge and thrown in my own jail before sundown. He was not unkind, but he was a pragmatist. Get your children checked by the doctor. They've been through an ordeal. And you, he said, looking at Ethan, watch your back. If what you say is true, you've made a very powerful enemy. They left the marshal's office feeling a profound sense of isolation. The law, their only hope, was a fortress they could not yet enter. Following Donovan's advice, they went to see the town physician, Dr. Alistair Finch. He was an elderly man with kind eyes and a gentle demeanor that immediately put them at ease. He listened to a carefully edited version of their story with deep sympathy, tut-tutting as he examined a still-recovering Clara. "The poor dear," he said, patting her head. "You've all been through a terrible time." He gave Eleanor a bottle of herbal tonic for her nerves and assured them the children were strong. He asked gentle questions about their plans, where they were staying, all under the guise of wanting to be able to check on them later. For the first time in days, Eleanor felt a flicker of hope, a sense of being cared for by a decent man. They thanked him profusely and left, walking down the dusty main street with a renewed, if fragile, sense of purpose. They did not see the change that came over Dr. Finch the moment his office door closed. The kindly mask fell away, replaced by a look of sheer, abject terror. His hands shaking, he hurried to his desk, lit a lamp against the gathering dusk, and began to write a hasty, coded message. It spoke of a ghost returned, a cowboy with defiance in his eyes, and a story that could ruin them all. He sealed the note, his face slick with a cold sweat, and gave it to a young stable boy with a coin. "Take this to the telegraph office," he rasped. "Send it to this address. Immediately. It's a matter of life and death." As Ethan and Eleanor headed back towards the isolation of their ranch, believing they had made their first move, they were completely unaware that they had just revealed their hand to the devil himself, and that their most trusted new friend was, in fact, his oldest secret ally. Part 5. Redemption's Reckoning. Sevens. The telegram from Dr. Finch arrived at Judge Marcus Thorne's stately office like a death warrant delivered in reverse. Reading the coded message under the glow of a gas lamp, the judge's placid, authoritative mask crumbled into a sneer of pure, undiluted rage. The woman was not just alive, she was fighting back. The cowboy was not just a grieving recluse, he was a guardian. And they had dared to bring his name into the halls of the very law he commanded. This was no longer a matter of recovering an asset. It was an act of extermination against a secret that now threatened to burn down his entire empire. He summoned Silas Kane, his voice devoid of all its previous cultured tones, replaced now by the flat, cold deadliness of a serpent. "The time for whispers is over," Thorne hissed, his fingers drumming a frantic, agitated rhythm on his mahogany desk. "The woman has become a liability. The cowboy, an obstacle. But the girl is my legacy. I want you to ride to that ranch, and I want you to burn it to the ground. Kill the man. Kill the old one. If the woman resists, kill her too. But you bring me the girl, unharmed. Do you understand me, Silas?" Kane, standing impassively in the shadows, simply nodded. There was a gleam of anticipation in his reptilian eyes. The pretense was over. He was finally being unleashed. Back at the ranch, an uneasy quiet had settled, but it was not peace. It was the heavy, charged silence of an impending storm. Since their return from Ridgewood, Ethan had worked with a feverish intensity, transforming the isolated cabin into a defensible fortress. He had reinforced the doors, boarded up the north-facing windows, and created strategic firing positions. He cleaned and oiled every weapon he owned: the Colt, his Winchester rifle, and an old, heavy scattergun. Jed, understanding what was coming without needing to be told, had sharpened his axe and sat on the porch for hours, methodically loading shells for his shotgun, his face a grim, determined mask. Inside this fortress, Eleanor was no longer a ghost. The fear was still a living thing inside her, but it had been cornered by a fiercer emotion: a mother's rage. She gathered and stored water, prepared bandages from old linen, and spoke to Clara in a calm, steady voice, teaching her a game. "When I say the words, 'still as a stone,'" she instructed the child, "you and Samuel will hide in the root cellar, and you will not make a sound until I come for you. Can you do that for me?" Clara, sensing the gravity beneath the game, nodded solemnly. This was their new reality. A family preparing not for winter, but for war. The attack came at dusk. The sky was bruised purple and red, and long, eerie shadows stretched from the pines. There was no warning shout, no demand for surrender. The first sign was the sharp, whining crack of a rifle shot, and the window pane above Eleanor's head exploding inward in a shower of glittering glass. Chaos erupted. Ethan, who had been watching the tree line from the porch, dove back inside, returning fire with his Winchester. "They're here!" he roared. "Eleanor, get them down! Jed, the west window!" Gunfire erupted from 3 different positions in the trees, a coordinated assault designed to pin them down. Bullets thudded into the log walls of the cabin, splintering the wood, each impact a deadly hammer blow. Jed, moving with the surprising agility of an old mountain cat, took his position, the barrels of his shotgun resting on the sill. "Got 2 of the bastards near the corral," he yelled over the din. Eleanor, her face set and pale, uttered the words, "still as a stone," and watched Clara lead her infant brother through the trapdoor to the cellar without a single tear. Her children were safe. Now she could fight. She became the silent, efficient quartermaster of their desperate defense. As Ethan emptied a rifle, she was there, pressing a reloaded one into his hands, her movements swift and sure. The air grew thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder and the percussive roar of the guns. For what felt like an eternity, they were trapped in a maelstrom of violence, the small cabin their only shield against the wave of death crashing against it. Silas Kane, directing the assault from the cover of the trees, grew impatient. The cowboy and the old man were better fighters than he had anticipated. He needed to change the dynamic, to force them out of their sanctuary. "Burn the barn," he snarled to one of his 2 hired guns. "Smoke them out like rats." The man scurried off with a lit torch. From his window, Jed saw the flicker of fire near the hayloft. "They're firing the barn! Ethan!" he yelled, his voice raw with fury. "All that hay, it'll go up like a tinderbox. Our horses." He didn't hesitate. Kicking open the back door, he laid down a spray of covering fire with his shotgun and made a desperate, charging run towards the barn. It was a brave move, but a foolish one. A rifle shot cracked from the darkness, and Jed cried out, stumbling to his knees, clutching a blossoming red stain on his shoulder. Seeing his friend fall, something primal snapped in Ethan. All strategy, all caution, was consumed by a tidal wave of protective rage. "Eleanor, keep them pinned," he shouted, before launching himself out the same back door, firing his Colt as he ran, providing a desperate cover for the wounded Jed. The burning barn cast a hellish, dancing light over the battlefield, illuminating the stark drama of life and death. Ethan managed to drag Jed behind the relative cover of a water trough, the old man groaning but conscious. It was then that Silas Kane emerged from the shadows, a predator moving in for the kill. The final confrontation was not a noble duel. It was a brutal, desperate brawl in the mud and flickering firelight. With their guns emptied, it came down to fists and knives and the sheer will to survive. Ethan fought with the strength of a man who had nothing left to lose and everything to protect. Kane fought with the cold, precise cruelty of a man who enjoyed his work. They crashed through the corral fence, their struggle a whirlwind of desperate violence. Kane pulled a long Bowie knife, its blade gleaming in the firelight. He lunged, and Ethan barely managed to turn the blade, the steel slicing a deep gash along his forearm. As they grappled, Ethan's head was slammed against a fence post. His vision swam, and for a terrifying second, Kane was on top of him, the knife poised to strike. In that moment, illuminated by the roaring inferno of the barn, Ethan saw it. He saw the silver chain around Kane's neck, and the small, familiar shape of the locket resting against the man's chest. It was a symbol of everything that had been stolen from him, everything he was fighting for. A surge of pure, unadulterated adrenaline coursed through him. With a roar that was more animal than human, he bucked Kane off him. He lunged not for the knife, but for the chain. He wrapped his fist around it and pulled with all his might. The silver links bit into his fingers, but they held. With a final, desperate wrench, he tore it from Kane's neck, the metal searing a line across the man's skin. He clutched the locket in his fist, a hard, solid piece of his reclaimed past. At that moment of triumph, Kane's two remaining men closed in, their rifles leveled at Ethan's chest. It was over. He was out of bullets, wounded, and cornered. Suddenly, a new volley of gunfire erupted, not from the cabin, but from the ridge overlooking the ranch. It was the authoritative, booming report of a government-issue rifle. One of Kane's men crumpled to the ground. The other, startled, turned towards the new threat. A calm, commanding voice cut through the night. "This is United States Marshal Donovan. Drop your weapons." Through the smoke, Ethan could see two figures on horseback, silhouetted against the night sky. The marshal had come. After their visit, Donovan's professional instincts had been piqued. He had sent a telegram to a colleague in Kansas, asking about Judge Thorne's land acquisitions. The reply had been unsettling, speaking of shell companies and suspiciously timed deaths of previous landowners. When he'd received a tip that Thorne had hired a group of known regulators for a job in his county, Donovan knew the ghost story was true. He had ridden out immediately, arriving not as a savior from nowhere, but as the law finally catching up to the crime. Faced with a U.S. Marshal, the remaining gunman threw down his rifle. Silas Kane, his face a mask of disbelief and fury, made a desperate grab for his own pistol, but a shot from Donovan's rifle kicked it from his hand. The battle was over. The roar of the burning barn was the only sound for a long moment. Medics would see to Jed's wound, which was painful but not fatal. Kane and his man were in irons. As the smoke began to clear, Ethan staggered to his feet, ignoring the searing pain in his arm. He looked at the cabin, where Eleanor was just emerging from the door, her face streaked with soot and tears. He slowly, painfully, opened his clenched fist. There, resting in his palm, grimy and blood-spattered but whole, was the small silver locket, its engraved initials still visible in the firelight. He had won the battle for his home. He had won the battle for his family. And he had just taken back the first piece of their stolen life. Part 6. Where the Wild Grass Grows. Sevens. The immediate aftermath of the battle was a landscape of stark, surreal contrasts. The hellish roar of the burning barn had subsided into a mournful crackle, sending plumes of gray smoke curling into the star-dusted sky, a funeral pyre for a violent past. In the cool, clean air, the scent of gunpowder mingled with the smell of scorched pine. Marshal Wade Donovan, a figure of unwavering authority amidst the chaos, moved with grim efficiency, his deputy binding the hands of a defeated Silas Kane and his one remaining gunman. Kane, his face a mask of cold fury, said nothing until Donovan stood before him. "He'll hang you for this, lawman," Kane spat, venom in his voice. Donovan looked down at him, his expression unreadable. "No," he said, his voice calm. "He'll be too busy trying to save his own neck." He held up the locket, its silver surface blackened with soot, which Ethan had pressed into his hand as proof. "Your loyalty ends where the rope begins. You can either hang alone, or you can tell me everything you know about every crime Judge Thorne has ever committed." The choice was no choice at all. In the flickering firelight, the serpent began to eat its own tail. Nearby, Eleanor, her hands steady now, was tending to Jed's shoulder, tearing bandages with a focused intensity. The old man, pale and gritting his teeth against the pain, looked from her to Ethan. "You brought a storm home, boy," Jed rasped, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "But it seems you knew how to ride it out." Ethan knelt beside him, his own exhaustion a heavy cloak upon his shoulders. He had won. They were alive. But the cost was written in blood and ash all around them. The war was not truly over until the man who had started it was brought to justice. In the week that followed, news traveled on the telegraph wires and in the hushed conversations of townsfolk. Marshal Donovan, armed with Kane's exhaustive confession and the locket as a tangible link to the past, rode not to the county seat, but to the state capital. He returned with federal warrants and 2 grim-faced agents. Judge Marcus Thorne was arrested not in a hail of gunfire, but in the quiet dignity of his own chambers, a place where he had perverted justice for years. His empire of fear and corruption, built on secrets and lies, crumbled with astonishing speed. His name became a curse, his reputation a ruin. The story of the ghost woman of Ridgewood, the homesteader who fought back, became a local legend. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place one quiet afternoon, when a shaken Dr. Alistair Finch appeared at the ranch. He found Ethan and Jed working on the foundations of a new barn. With tears in his eyes, the old doctor confessed everything: the false death certificate, the years of silence enforced by Thorne's threats against his grandchildren. He did not ask for forgiveness. He simply handed Ethan a sworn affidavit, his detailed confession, to give to the marshal. "I chose my family's safety over my soul," he said, his voice trembling. "I cannot undo that, but I can help ensure no other family suffers as yours has." It was a quiet, pathetic, but necessary act of redemption. The last shadow of Thorn's influence had been exorcised by the light of truth. As spring thawed the frozen land, a different kind of rebuilding began at the ranch. The physical act of raising a new barn became a symbol of their new life. Word had spread, and one morning, a wagon appeared, then another. Neighbors, who had once viewed Ethan with suspicion, now came with hammers, lumber, and helping hands. They had heard the story of his fight, of Eleanor's survival, and in this harsh land where community was the ultimate currency, they offered their respect in the form of sweat and labor. The sounds of hammering and sawing replaced the echo of gunfire. Laughter, a sound long absent from these acres, began to fill the air. Eleanor, no longer a prisoner of her past, found her voice again, not just in conversations with Ethan, but as a force for good. Seeing the handful of ranch children with no formal schooling, she started a small, informal class in their newly rebuilt cabin, using smoothed pieces of slate and charcoal for lessons. She taught them reading, writing, and arithmetic, and in doing so, she taught herself how to be part of the world again. Her quiet strength and gentle nature drew people in, and the woman once sold as quiet stock became a respected pillar of their small, scattered community. Ethan watched her, his heart filled with a love so profound it was almost painful. He saw the return of the vibrant, hopeful woman he had thought lost forever, now tempered with the unbreakable strength of a survivor. The truest healing happened in the small, unguarded moments. It happened when Ethan was teaching a determined Clara how to ride a small pony, his large hands guiding hers on the reins, their shared laughter echoing across the pasture. It happened when Eleanor would read to the children by the fire, Samuel gurgling in her lap, and she would look up to find Ethan's gaze on her, a look of such complete and utter devotion that it needed no words. The final wall around Ethan's heart crumbled one evening. After a long day of work, Clara, her cheeks flushed with sun and pride from a successful ride, ran to him and threw her small arms around his legs. She looked up at him, her eyes, his eyes, shining. "I did it, Papa," she said. The word, so simple, so natural, struck him with the force of a physical blow. Papa. It was a name, a title, a belonging he never knew he had craved. He froze for a moment, unable to speak, before sweeping her up into his arms, burying his face in her hair as a wave of emotion he had suppressed for years finally washed over him. Later that night, when the children were asleep, he came to Eleanor as she sat by the fire. He said nothing, but simply knelt before her and opened his hand. In his calloused palm lay the small, simple engagement ring he had commissioned 5 years ago, the one he had kept buried in a locked box like a relic. "It waited for you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Tears streamed down Eleanor's face as she extended her hand, allowing him to slide the ring onto her finger. It was not a question, but a confirmation of a promise that not even fire and death could break. Their wedding day was not marked on any calendar. It took place on the first true morning of summer, on the same hilltop overlooking the plains where they had first spoken of a future together. There was no preacher, no crowd, only the vast, blue sky as their cathedral and the whispering prairie grass as their witness. Jed was there, his arm in a sling, a proud glint in his old eyes. Marshal Donovan had ridden out, not as a lawman, but as a friend. Ethan wore a clean shirt, and Eleanor wore a simple cotton dress, her hair unbound and flowing in the gentle breeze. Clara, barefoot and beaming, held a bouquet of wildflowers, while Samuel slept peacefully in a basket. Ethan did not have a gold ring. Instead, he knelt and braided a long, tough strand of prairie grass. He took her hand, and then his own, and gently wrapped the grass around both their wrists, binding them together. "There's no altar, no choir," he said, his voice low and steady, carrying on the wind. "Just this, a promise made in dust and blood and all the years we lost. I am yours, Eleanor. All the broken parts, and all the parts you've made whole again." Eleanor's hand tightened over his, her tears not of sorrow, but of overwhelming joy. "I was always yours, Ethan," she whispered. "Even when the world called me dead, my heart knew its way home. It was always you." He stood and drew her close, their foreheads touching. Clara ran to them, flinging her arms around their legs. "This time," she declared with the absolute certainty of a child, "we all stay." And in the profound stillness of that perfect moment, something settled. The ghosts were finally gone, replaced by the warmth of the sun and the promise of 1,000 tomorrows. They were no longer just survivors. They were a family, forged in the fiercest of fires, their roots now deeply entwined in the rich, wild earth of a home they had built together. The story of Ethan Cole and Eleanor Vance is a testament to the stubborn resilience of the human heart, a truth as vast and enduring as the western sky itself. It began in the dust of a cruel auction block, with a desperate plea that reawakened a love long thought buried in ash and memory. Through the silence of a haunted cabin, the fury of a blizzard, and the fire of a desperate battle, what emerged was not the ghost of a tragic past, but the powerful, living echo of a promise that refused to be broken. Their journey teaches us that the deepest wounds are not inflicted by fire or by fists, but by the loss of hope, and the only true antidote is the courage to fight for a second chance. Family, we learn, is not simply a matter of blood, but a fortress built by choice, defended by sacrifice, and cemented by a love that is brave enough to face down the devils of this world, whether they wear a gunman's belt or a judge's robe. Theirs is a story that proves that even after the longest, darkest winter, the wild grass will always find a way to grow again, stronger and greener in the places where it was once scorched. If the story of a love that outlasted death and a family forged in fire stirred something deep within you, then your journey with us has just begun. Subscribe to Wild West Love Stories, where we tell the tales of promises kept and hearts reclaimed. Like this video, share it with those who believe in the power of redemption, and ring the bell so you never miss a story from the untamed heart of the frontier. What promise in your own life have you fought to keep? Share your story in the comments below, for in every echo of the past, we find the strength for our future.